Chapter 35. The day soon grew hot, and the cattle, tired from their all-night walk, were sluggish and difficult to move. Call had to put half the crew on the drags to keep them going. Still, he was determined to get across the Nueces, for Dietz had said he expected it to storm again that night. There was no avoiding the brush entirely, but Dietz had found a route that took them slightly downriver and around the worst of the thickets. As they got close to the river, they began to encounter swarms of mosquitoes, which attacked horses and men alike, settling on them so thickly that they could be wiped off like stains. All the men covered their faces as best they could, and the few who had gloves put them on. The horses were soon flinching, stamping and swishing their tails, their withers covered with mosquitoes. The cattle were restive too, mosquitoes around their eyes and in their nostrils. Newt was soon so covered with blood from mashed mosquitoes that he looked as if he had been wounded in battle. Sean, who rode near him, was no better. Any inconvenience made Sean think of home, and the mosquitoes were a big inconvenience. "I'd like to be going to Ireland," he told Newt. "If only I knew where the boats were, I'd be going." His face was lumpy from mosquito bites. "I guess we'll drown the skeeters when we hit the river," Newt said. It was the only thing that promised relief. He'd been dreading the river, but that was before the mosquitoes hit. To make matters worse, one particular red cow had begun to irritate him almost beyond endurance. She had developed a genius for wiggling into thickets and stopping. Shouting made no impression on her at all. She would stand in the thicket looking at him, well aware that she was safe. Once Newt dismounted, planning to scare her on foot, but she lowered her head menacingly, and he abandoned that idea. Time and time again she hid in the thicket, and time again, after shouting himself hoarse, he would give up and force his horse into the thicket after her. The cow would bolt out, popping limbs with her horns as if she meant to lead the herd. But when the next thicket appeared, she would wiggle right in. She was so much trouble that he was sorely tempted to leave her. It seemed to him the boys were driving the herd, and he was just driving the one red cow. Once the mosquitoes hit, the cow's dilatoriness became almost more than Newt could endure. The cow would stand in the thicket and look at him silently and stupidly, moving only when she had to, and stooping again as soon as she could find a convenient thicket. Newt fought down a terrible urge just to pull his gun and shoot her. That would show the hussy. Nothing less was going to make any impression on her. He had never felt so provoked by a single animal before. But he couldn't shoot her, and he couldn't leave her. The captain wouldn't approve of either action. He'd already shouted himself hoarse. All he could do was pop her out of the thicket after thicket. Call had taken the precaution of buying a lead steer from the Pumphreys, a big, docile longhorn they called Old Dog. The steer had never been to Montana, of course, but he had led several herds to Matagorda Bay. Call figured the old steer would at least last until they had the herd well trail broken. "Old dogs like me," Augustus said, watching Dish Boggets edge the old steer to the front of the herd in preparation for the crossing. "How's that?" Call asked. "Lazy, you mean?" "Sure, Augustus said. "He don't get excited about little things." "You don't get excited about nothing," Call said, "not unless it's biscuits and whores." "So what was Jake up to?" he asked. It rankled him that the man was being so little help. Jake had done many irritating things in his rangering days, but nothing as aggravating as bringing a whore along on a cattle drive. "Jake was up being Jake," Augustus said. "It's a full-time job. He requires a woman to help him with it." Dish had gradually eased Old Dog to the front of the herd, working slowly and quietly. The old steer was twice as big as most of the scrawny yearlings that made up the herd. His horns were long, and they bent irregularly, as if they were jointed. Just before the men reached the river, they came out into a clearing a mile or more wide. It was a relief after the constant battle with the mesquite and chaparral. The grass was tall. Call loped through it with Dietz to look at the crossing. Dish trotted over to Augustus on the trim sorrel he called Mustache, a fine horse whose eyes were always watching to see that no rebellious cow tried to make a break for freedom. Dish uncoiled his rope and made a few practice throws at a low mesquite seedling. Then he even took a throw for a joke at a low-flying buzzard that had just risen off a carcass of an armadillo. "I guess you're practicing so you can rope a woman if you make it to Ogallala," Augustus said. "You don't have to rope women in that town, I hear," Dish said. "They rope you." "It's a long way to Nebraska," Augustus said. "You'll be ready to be roped by then, Dish." "Where'd you go for half the morning?" Dish asked. He was hoping Gus would talk a little about Lorena, though part of him didn't want to hear it, since it would involve Mr. Jake Spoon. "Oh, Miss Lorena and I like to take our coffee together in the morning," Augustus said. "I hope the weather didn't treat her too bad," Dish said, feeling wistful suddenly. He could think of nothing pleasanter than taking coffee with Lorena in the morning. No, she's fine," Augustus said. "The fresh air agrees with her, I guess." Dish said no more, and Augustus decided not to tease him. Occasionally the very youngness of the young moved him to charity. They had no sense of swiftness of life, nor of its limits. The years would pass like weeks, and loves would pass too, or else grow sour. Young Dish, skilled cowhand that he was, might not live to see the horrors of Ogallala, and the tender feelings he harbored for Lorena might be the sweetest he would ever have. Looking at Dish so tight with his need for Lorena, whom he would probably never have, Augustus remembered his own love for Clara Allen. It had pained him and pleased him at once. As a young woman, Clara had such grace that just looking at her could choke a man. Then, she was always laughing, though her life had not been the easiest. Despite her cheerful eyes, Clara was prone to sudden angers and sadness so deep that nothing he could say or do would prompt her to answer him or even look at him. When she left to marry her horse trader, he felt that he had missed the great opportunity of his life. For all their fun together, he had not quite been able to touch her, either in her happiness or her sadness. It wasn't because of his wife, either. It was because Clara had chosen the angle of their relation. She had loved him in certain ways, wanted him for certain purposes, and all his strain, his tricks, his looks, and his experience could not induce her to alter the angle. The day she told him she was going to marry the horse trader from Kentucky, he had been too stunned to say much. She just told him plainly, with no fuss. Bob was the kind of man she needed, and that was that. He could remember the moment still. They had been standing in front of her little store in Austin, and she had taken his hand and held it for a time. "Well, Clara," he said, feeling lame, "I think you're a fool, but I wish you happiness. I guess I'll see you from time to time." "You won't if I can help it, Gus," she said. "You leave me be for the next 10 years or so, then come and visit." "Why 10 years?" he asked, puzzled. Clara grinned. Her humor never rested for long. "Well, I'll be a wife," she said. "I won't be wanting to be tempted by the likes of you. But once I've got the hang of married life, I'll want you to come." It made no sense at all to Augustus. "Why?" he asked. "Planning to run off after 10 years or what?" "No," Clara said, "but I want my children to know you. I'd want them to have your friendship." It struck him that he was already years late. It had been some 16 years since Clara held his hand in front of the store. He had not watched the time closely, but it wouldn't matter. It might only mean that there would be more children for him to be friends with. "I may just balk in Ogallala," he said out loud. Dish was surprised. "Well, balk any time you want, Gus," he said. Augustus was put out with himself for having spoken his thoughts. Still, the chance of settling near Clara and her family appealed to him more than the thought of following Call into another wilderness. Clara was an alert woman who, even as a girl, had read all the papers. He would have someone to talk to about the events of the times. Call had no interest in the events of the times, and a person like P.I. wouldn't even know what an event was. It would be nice to chat regularly with a woman who kept up, though of course it was possible that 16 years on the frontier had taken the edge off Clara's curiosity. "Can you read, Dish?" he asked. "Well, I know my letters," Dish said. "I can read some words. Of course, there's plenty I ain't had no practice with." A few hundred yards away, they could see Call and Dietz riding along the riverbank, studying the situation. "I wished we was up to the Red River," Dish said. "I don't like this low country." "I wish we was up to the Yellowstone myself," Augustus said. "Maybe Captain Call would be satisfied with that." When they reached the river, it seemed that it was going to be the smoothest crossing possible. Old Dog seemed to have an affinity for Dietz and followed him right into the water without so much as stopping to sniff. Call and Dish, Augustus, Petey, and Needle Nelson spread out on the downriver side, but the cattle showed no signs of wanting to do anything but follow Old Dog. The water was muddy brown and the current fast, but the cattle only had to swim a few yards. One or two small bunches attempted to turn back, but with most of the crew surrounding them, they didn't make a serious challenge. Despite the smoothness, Newt felt a good deal afraid and shut his eyes for a second when his horse went to a swimming depth and the water came over the saddle. But he got no wetter, and he opened his eyes to see that he was almost across the river. He struck the fair bank almost at the same time as the skinny brown longhorn. Mouse and the steer struggled up the bank side by side. It was just as Newt turned to watch the last of the cattle cross that a scream cut the air, so terrible that it almost made him faint. Before he could even look toward the scream, P.I. went racing past him, with the captain just behind. They both had coiled ropes in their hands as they raced their horses back into the water. Newt wondered what they meant to do with the ropes. Then his eyes found Shawn, who was screaming again and again in a way that made Newt want to cover his ears. He saw that Shawn was barely clinging to his horse and that a lot of brown things were wiggling around him and over him. At first, with the screaming going on, Newt couldn't figure out what the brown things were. They seemed like giant worms. His mind took a moment to work out what his eyes were seeing. The giant worms were snakes, water moccasins. Even as the realization struck him, Mr. Guts and Dietz went into the river behind P.I. and the captain. How they all got there so fast he couldn't say, for the screams had just started as Mouse and steers had reached the top of the bank, so close that Newt could see droplets of water on the steers' horns. Then the scream stopped abruptly as Shawn slipped under the water. His voice was replaced almost at once by the frenzied neighing of the horse, which began to thrash in the water and soon turned back toward the far bank. As he gained footing and rose out of the water, he shook 3 snakes from his body, one slithering off his neck. P.I. and the captain were beating about themselves with their coiled ropes. Newt saw Shawn come to the surface downstream, but he wasn't screaming anymore. P leaned far off his horse and managed to catch Shawn's arm, but then his horse got frightened of the snakes and P lost his hold. Dietz was close by. When Shawn come up again, P got him by the collar and held on. Shawn was silent, though. Newt could see his mouth was open. Dietz got P's horse by the bridle and kept it still. P managed to get his hands under Shawn's arm and drag him across the saddle. The snakes had scattered, but several could be seen on the surface of the river. Dish Boggett had his rifle drawn, but was too shaken by the sight to shoot. Dietz waved him back. Suddenly there was a loud crack. Mr. Gus had shot a snake with his big Colt. Twice more he shot, and 2 more snakes disappeared. The captain rode close to P and helped him support Shawn's body. In a minute, P's horse was across the deep water and found its footing. Call and Dietz held the horse still while P took the dying boy in his arms. Then Dietz led the horse ashore. Augustus rode out of the water behind Call. The cattle were still crossing, but no cowboys were crossing with them. Bert, the Rainey boys, and Alan O'Brien were on the south bank, not eager to take the water. A mile back across the long clearing, the wagon and the horses had just come in sight. P handed the boy down to Dish and Dietz. Call quickly took his slicker off his saddle, and they laid the boy on it. His eyes were closed, his body jerking slightly. Augustus cut the boy's shirt off. There were 8 sets of fang marks, including one on his neck. "That don't count the legs," Augustus said. "There ain't no point in counting the legs." "What done it?" Dish asked. He'd seen the snakes plenty and even wanted to shoot them, but he couldn't believe it or understand it. "It was his bad luck to strike a nest of them, I guess," Augustus said. "I never seen a nest of snakes in this river before. I've crossed it 100 times. I've never seen that many snakes in any river." "The storm got 'em stirred up," Dietz said. Call knelt by the boy, helpless to do one thing for him. It was the worst luck to come all the way from Ireland and then ride into a swarm of water moccasins. He remembered years before in a hot, droughty summer, stopping to water his horse in a dry lake far up the Brazos. He'd ridden his horse in so he could drink and happened to look down to see the muddy shallows of the lake were alive with cottonmouths. The puddles were like nests filled with wiggling snakes as brown as chocolate. Fortunately, he had not ridden into such a puddle. The sight unnerved him so that he shot a snake on reflex, a useless act to shoot one where there were hundreds. He had seen the occasional snake in rivers along the coast, but never more than 1 or 2 together. There had been at least 20, probably more, around the boy. On the south bank, the horse he had ridden was rolling over and over in the mud, ignored by the frightened cowboys. Maybe the horse was bitten too. P, who had been the first to the rescue, swimming his mount right into the midst of the snakes, suddenly felt so weak he thought he could have fallen off his horse. He dismounted, clinging to the horn in case his legs gave out. Augustus noticed how white he was and went to him. "Are you snake bit, P?" he asked, for in the confusion a man could get wounds he wasn't aware of. He had known more than one man to take bullets without noticing it. One ranger had been so frightened when his wound was pointed out to him that he died of fright, not the bullet. "I don't think I'm bit," P said. I think I whooped them off." "Get your pants down," Call said. "One could have struck you down low." They could find no wounds on P. Meanwhile, the cattle had begun to drift with no one watching them cross. Some were making the bank 100 yards downstream. The cowboys on the south bank still had not crossed. "Gus, you and Dietz watch 'em," Call said, mounting. "We've got to keep the cattle from drifting." He noticed Newt sitting beside P's horse, his face white as powder. "Come help us," he said, as P and Dish loped off toward the cattle. Newt turned his horse and followed the captain, feeling that he was doing wrong. He should have said something to Shawn, even if Shawn couldn't hear him. He wanted to tell Shawn to go on and find a boat somewhere and go back to Ireland, quick, whatever the captain might think. Now he knew Shawn was going to die, and that it was forever too late for him to find the boat. But he wanted to say it anyway. He had had a chance to say it, but he had missed it. He trotted beside the captain, feeling that he might vomit, and also feeling disloyal to Shawn. He wanted to go back to Ireland, he said, suddenly tears pouring out of his eyes. He was so grieved he didn't care. "Well, I expect he did," the captain said quietly. Newt held his reins, still crying, and let Mouse do the work. He remembered Shawn's screams and how much the snakes had looked like giant wiggly worms. When the last cattle were started back toward the main herd, the captain put his horse back into the river, which startled Newt. He didn't see how anybody could just ride back into a river that could suddenly be filled with snakes, but this time no snakes appeared. Newt saw that Mr. Gus and Dietz had not moved and wondered if Shawn was dead yet. He kept feeling he ought to leave the cattle and go talk to Shawn, even if it was too late for Shawn to answer, but he was afraid to. He didn't know what to do, and he sat on his horse and he cried until he started vomiting. He had to lean over and vomit beneath his horse's neck. In his mind, he had begun to wish for some way to undo what had happened, to make the days run backward to the time when they were still in Lonesome Dove. He imagined Shawn alive and well, and did what he had not done. Told him to go off to Galveston and find a boat, take him home. But he kept looking back, and there was Dietz and Mr. Gus kneeling by Shawn. He longed to see Shawn sit up and be all right, but Shawn didn't, and Newt could only sit hopelessly on his horse and hold the cattle. Augustus and Dietz could do little for Shawn except to sit with him while his life was ending. "I guess it'd been better if he had just let him drown," Augustus said. "He was an unlucky young sprout." "Mighty unlucky," Dietz said. He felt an unsteadiness in his limbs. Though he had seen much violent death, he had not seen one more terrible than the one that had just occurred. He felt he would never again cross a river without remembering it. Before his brother crossed the river, Shawn O'Brien died. Augustus covered the boy with his slicker just as the horse herd came clambering up the bank. The herd passed so close that when some of the horses stopped to shake themselves, the fine spray wet Dietz's back. The Spettle boys came out of the river wide-eyed with fright, clinging to their wet mounts. On the far bank, Call had the other men helping to ease the wagon down the steep crossing. "Now if them snakes had come at Bull, he would have had a chance," Augustus said. "He has a 10-gauge. "The stores stirred them up," Dietz said again. He felt guilty, for he had chosen the crossing in preference to one up the river, and now the boy was dead. "Well, Dietz, life is short," Augustus said. "Shorter for some than others. This is a bad way to start a trip." Boulevard was unhappy. He didn't think the wagon would make it, even across such a small river, but he was not willing to leave it either. He sat grimly on the wagon seat, Lippy beside him, while the cowboys got the ropes on the wagon. "You mean Shawn's dead?" Alan O'Brien asked the captain, so stunned he could barely speak. "Yes, he's dead," Call said. He had seen Gus cover the corpse. "It's me that done it," Alan said, tears on his round face. "I never should have brought the boy. I knew he was too young." Call said nothing more. The boy's age had had nothing to do with what had happened. Of course, even an experienced man riding into such a mess of snakes wouldn't have survived. He himself might not have, and he had never worried about snakes. It only went to show what he had already knew, which was that there were more dangers in life than even the sharpest training could anticipate. Alan O'Brien should waste no time on guilt, for a boy could die in Ireland as readily as anywhere else, however safe it might appear. Jasper and Bert had seen the snakes, and Jasper was so terrified that he couldn't look at the water. Soupy Jones was almost as scared. The Rainey boys looked as if they might fall off their horses. More than anything, Jasper wanted to quit. He had crossed the Nueces many times, and yet as the moment approached when he would have to do it again, he felt he couldn't. P and Dish and the others who had already crossed seemed to him like the luckiest men in the world. "Captain, do you reckon them snakes are gone?" he asked. "Well, they're scattered," Call said. As they got ready to go in, Jasper drew his pistol, but Call shook his head. "No shooting," he said. He had no confidence that any of the men could shoot from a swimming horse and hit anything as Gus had. "Just quirt 'em if you see any," he added. "I hope none don't crawl in this wagon," Lippy said, his lip quivering with apprehension. The wagon floated better than expected. Bolivar barely got his feet wet. Jasper flinched once when he saw a stick he thought was a snake, but the moccasins had scattered and were not seen again. Alan O'Brien dismounted and stood and cried over his brother. Jasper Fant cried too, mostly from relief that he was still alive. While they were having their cry, Dietz and P got shovels from the wagon and dug a grave back from the river 100 yards beside a live oak tree. Then they cut off part of one of the wagon sheets, wrapped the dead body in it, and carried him in the wagon to the grave. They laid him in it, and Dietz and P soon covered him while most of the crew stood around not knowing what to do or say. "If you'd like to sing or something, do it," Call said. Alan stood a moment, started singing an Irish song in a quavering voice, then broke down crying and couldn't finish it. "I don't have no piano, or I'd play one of the church hymns," Lippy said. "Well, I'll say a word," Augustus said. "This was a good, brave boy, for we all saw that he conquered his fear of riding. He had a fine tenor voice, and we all miss that. But he wasn't used to this part of the world. There's accidents in life, and he met with a bad one. We may all do the same if we ain't careful." He turned and mounted old Malaria. "Dust to dust," he said. "Let's the rest of us go on to Montana." He's right, Call thought. The best thing to do with a death was to move on from it. One by one the cowboys mounted and went off to the herd, many of them taking a quick last look at the muddy grave under the tree. Augustus waited for Alan O'Brien, who was the last to mount. He was so weak from shock it seemed he might not be able to, but he finally got on his horse and rode off, looking back until the grave was hidden by the tall gray grass. "Seems too quick," he said. "Seems very quick, just to ride off and leave the boy. He was the babe of our family, Ad. If we was in town, we'd have a fine funeral for him," Augustus said, "but as you can see, we ain't in town. There's nothing you can do but kick your horse." "I wish I could have finished the song," Alan said.